successful 30-year titan in business with having multiple businesses that generate multiplied millions of dollars.
And if that plan happens to be to build $1 million company, which I can help you do.
But he's humble. He's a man of God. He's a family man.
The world's news organizations are built on everything but positivity.
He is an influential entrepreneur and business figure for over 30 years.
I've got to forecast. I've got to pronounce. I've got to project. I've got to share with you my ideas, my vision, my goals for not only myself, but for you.
That's why he's came up with his incredible concept of taking and creating a platform for people that are wired differently.
And you got to understand that your habits of your person and your habits of your business and your habits of your spirituality have to lead to the North Star of who you are. We need to figure out who we want to be in life. Good morning, good morning, good morning. I've got my podcast gear on today. I've got the microphone. I've got the green screen. I've got my coffee. Good morning, and check out. Everybody knows where I'm at, man. I'm at the donut capital of the world. I got to tell you, it's such a blessing to be here and to be able to travel around the country and to do what I do. I literally feel like the most spoiled man on earth. And I think of you guys when I start to think about basically how spoiled I am in some regards because of the feedback I get and all the nice stories and all the kind stories and response to what we're having with this run of Wired Differently. You know, it's funny how you believe, you prepare, you attack, and you do all these things. And I read my own books sometimes because I forget some of the things I'm even teaching people and telling people sometimes, and I take it for granted. But man, I mean, I can't tell you how many times in the last 4+ years that I've said to probably Heather and quietly to my wife, like, what am I doing here? What is Wired Differently all about? Why are you basically risking your time from 14 other successful companies that are moving on down the road and kicking tail and taking names and growing people and proven success, proven income, proven residual income, better yet, proven. I mean, and so why would you go away from that to do this? You've really, to date, you've not made any money. I mean, you have revenue coming in, but my goodness, Todd, you're spending so much money on stage mixers and speakers and projectors and books. I mean, every book I write is epic. I mean, I don't think people realize that, to write a book is, many people say they're going to go write a book, and I want to encourage you. I want to help you. I'll coach you. I'll give you some ideas on writing a book. I'll save you years. I'm sure of that. Everybody's better with a coach, right? But at the end of the day, I mean, the amount of time and the effort and the story of the story is really basically at the heart of what we're trying to understand in our lives, and for better yet, for other people. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the story is about other people. You don't tell stories. You don't wake up with stories. You don't do the stories. You don't become a story if not for other people to hear the story. And there's only one reason for a story, and that is to teach people. Right? The greatest storyteller of all time was Jesus Christ. Jesus is the master of telling stories. And I remember starting building Wired Differently. I remember starting, like, what is this about? What I'm called to do and what God has asked me to do, and trying to triangulate all these things and, like, where do I fit God? It's just too much. It's just too much. How do I continue to do what I'm doing, but yet grow this and actually make this probably the biggest company I've ever built? How can that be? So the story is of the story. The story I want to tell today is really the story of how important stories are. Because, we're wired differently. We're all wired differently. And as I grow with the brand and I grow with the calling, I just want to repeat these things. And I want to remind the people that are listening here, man, that we just do things differently. I mean, we get up differently. We go to bed differently. We cry differently. We fight differently. We win differently. We try differently. We mourn differently. We celebrate differently. We love differently. We do everything differently, right? Because we're wired differently. We're called to be something just a little bit a cut above, called to be something just a little bit different, something to be just a little odd, right? We're called to be misfits of this world because we're just different, not different like an adjective. I want you to be differently like an adverb. We are just differently. We're actionably different. Right? And in this calling and in this thing that we're doing, my job is to love you. My job is to encourage you. My job is to motivate you. My job is to inspire you. My job is to train you. My job is to teach you. My job is to be your coach. Matter of fact, I want to be your coach, and I'm America's coach. I want this to be our calling. I want to be able to build you personally, spiritually, and profitably. I mean, that's the story that needs to be told. And it's not my story that's being told right now. I'm just trying to share this with you. I'm basically stealing a story from a man called Jesus. And don't hear me. I'm not saying I'm Jesus. I'm just saying the greatest storyteller ever out there, ever recorded in the history of time, the #1 best-selling author of all time is God, and the lead actor was Jesus, and the story of the story was Jesus' story. The story was about to believe the unbelievable. Believe the unbelievable. So I tell stories. I remember in 2018, I met a man by the name of Raj Doraisamy, and I love this man to this day. We no longer work together on a regular basis. But I remember telling him one time when he asked me, what is your niche? What is your specialty? What is it something that you want to stand out about you? And I remember distinctively saying, I want to be a great storyteller. And my wife would tell you, yeah, you're a storyteller, right? Her sister Terry and Trudy, and they would say, yeah, he's a storyteller. Matter of fact, I remember moving in when I first moved to Florida several years ago, and I came into the neighborhood and I met everybody, and there was this lady that lived behind me. Her name was Mecky, and she's still there, but I don't live in the same house. But I remember moving there, and it was a little shack. It was a little torn up little fishing shack, and I don't know, we paid for we probably paid $27,000 for it, and then the market fell right after I bought it. And I thought, oh no, I overpaid. Oh gosh, I got beat on that one, right? And so, but anyways, I got the fishing shack, and I would drive to Florida. Then I'd fly to Florida, and I built this company outpost for Payserve there. But long story short is that Mecky lived behind me, and she kind of would scope me out, and she realized what I was driving and what was going on and this and that. And she was not about change at all. She was old guard and probably still is old guard. But I remember one day I kind of finally started to tear the house down and move some things around, and I put some trees in. I made it beautiful because I just love trees. I would really come into my tree thing, right? Growing palm trees and understanding trees. Because I only thought there was one palm tree when I moved to Florida. And now I have 25 species on my property alone. But I digress. But the bottom line is, I remember Mecky finally coming over, and she says, what are you doing to this property? And she talked to me about like that. I said, well, I'm going to make it better. I'm going to improve it. I'm going to make the neighborhood. I'm going to take this whole neighborhood, and someday it's going to change. It's going to look like Key West. And I remember her looking at me, and she's looking at the trees, and the yard was all tore up, and the house looked worse than when I even bought it. And it was not in a good space when I bought it. And she looked at me, and I looked at her, and I smiled, and I thought she would smile back at me, but she didn't. And she said these words to me that I'll never forget. She said, "You're just a storyteller, Todd." Man. A storyteller. Did you just call me a storyteller? You're a storyteller, Todd. And I remember thinking, I was like in 2000s, early 2000s, and I was offended by it, right? And I went and I told my wife, I said, "Hey, honey, you're going to blame the lady in the house. She said that this is that, and I'm not good enough. I'm tearing stuff down." And she called me a storyteller. And my wife looked at me and she said, "Well," something like, "if the shoe fits." Why do I tell stories? Why do I tell you the story? Because I literally own the fact that I'm a storyteller. Fast forward like 12 years, and I started to think about the earliest days of my life, and I started to write my first book, Wired Differently, in 2018, 2019. I remember thinking, I want to be a storyteller. And my mind goes all the way back, and I'm like, I was called a storyteller. Up until a certain point in my life, a storyteller was a negative thing, right? And I'm not that storyteller, but I want to be a storyteller. I remember going to trips as a little kid. I remember going to trips with my wife and taking the children, and we would take tours of certain places like in Chattanooga or South Carolina or certain places like that. And they would give us these tours of statues and things that are going on in these amazing war cities and historical foundations. And these tour guides would dress up, and when they would give their talk on how the bridge was built or the statue was laid or the county was made or the building was put together or the Congress was formed, and they would tell the story about this leader or this general and how he got on a brigade in a boat and he would do all these things and how he conquered the battle and won. And when they would tell the story of the greatest general or admiral of all time of the Civil War, and they were reenacting it, and they tell the story, and they're saluting, and they're in their outfits, and they're standing guard, and they're animated about the whole process. They weren't just telling a story, they became the story. I was enamored by it. I couldn't stop thinking about if I could only be that person. Well, what do you mean, Todd? Aren't you happy with who you are? You got companies, you got successful, you got children. No, but I want to be a storyteller. I really want to be that's in my soul. I want to be a storyteller. In this day and age of people being what they want to be and saying who they are and claiming their gender and all these kind of things, I just can't but help but think about what is inside of us crawling to get out on any given time. And inside me, I always wanted to be a storyteller. Isn't it funny? Isn't it curious? Isn't it ironic that I'm finally a storyteller? I'm finally telling the world stories. Not just on a national stage, not just on a local Angola, Indiana. I'm here at the EDC in the Wired Differently broadcast room. Come on by. I'm going to be in Angola for 2 weeks. I'd love to tell you some stories. I'd love to teach you some stories. And I'm going to tell you why stories are so important right now. But I want you to understand, come by, see me, check out the studio, get a hold of Abby, somehow find me. Let's talk. Let's understand. What is your story? What story can you tell? Why aren't you a storyteller? That the greatest gift we've been given on this planet is literally to associate and tell stories. Teachable, learnable stories. Not falsehoods, not things that are completely make believe without a meaning, purpose, or ending for good. Stories are for good. The greatest storyteller ever was Jesus. And when I say I wanted to be a storyteller, I think what I'm trying to tell you metaphorically is I want to be a preacher. That's the story. I want to be like my mentor. I want to be able to relate to people in a fashion that can pull the world together. I want to be able to tell the story of love and grace and inspiration. I want to be able to tell and relate to all people the best I can. I want to be able to tell the story of Wired differently. I remember as a little boy, the first stories were ever told to me. I'm sure some of them were in church. My parents would take us to church sparingly every now and then to a Methodist church, and there's pictures of me ringing the bell at a church. But I can't tell you that the earliest stories I remember were biblical stories. But I do remember stories that my father told me. He would tell me stories at nauseum about him and his brother, Teddy. Teddy was an older brother, basically 2 years older, I believe. My cousins would correct me. And Teddy was kinda in trouble. He was the better athlete, he was the bigger, child, he had probably more natural talent than most could ever understand. Teddy could do anything. And my dad looked up to Teddy, and my dad also had a little sister, and her name was Susie, and Susie looked up to my dad and looked up to Teddy as these little children grew up in a little town called Deerfield, Michigan, in a farming community. And my grandfather, who I knew only for a few years, drove a Standard Oil truck, and he would deliver oil to houses to keep them warm. But the stories my dad would tell me are the 1950s. My dad would be running around this community and trying to keep up with Teddy, but Teddy didn't channel his goodness or his talents. Teddy was just he was loose and abound, right? He would just get into crazy things and take my dad along with him. And my dad learned that Teddy, although he was gifted and talented in so many ways, that maybe my dad was the caretaker, not the overachiever. And so my dad would follow Teddy around. He would look up to him, but he would always constantly have to kind of figure a way to help Teddy out. He would always end up taking the fall with Teddy because Teddy was the explorer. Teddy was the one that was really, really wired differently in the family. Teddy was the one that wanted to just say, hey, I'm not like the rest of the world. I'm a little wired differently. I remember a story where my dad told me that him and Teddy were probably 7 or 8 years, 7 to 10 years old, some of the age range between them. And Teddy had just found a new machete. His grandfather, Hank, had probably given him this machete. And my father was telling the story about how Teddy grabbed the machete. He says, we need to go to the jungle. And my dad said to Teddy, we don't have any jungles around here. He goes, oh, there's jungles everywhere in the world. You have to just go out and take the jungle. You have to capture the way. You have to carve your own journey. I don't know if they just watched Roy Rogers or something on the TV at that point, one of 3 channels. And my dad said, well, there's no jungle. That machete's not going to cut down any vines or any trees. There's no jungle out there. Come on, Teddy. This is craziness. And Teddy says, there is a jungle, and we must conquer it. And my dad said, show me the jungle, Teddy. And Teddy said to my father, follow me. And those boys took off for the jungle. My father had no idea where he was going with Teddy. A 10-year-old boy with a machete? A 7-year-old boy with a understanding that his brother was half cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, but he was alluring, he was attractive, he was large and strong, and people wanted to be like him. And so he followed him around, knowing that what's around the corner with Teddy, I don't know what I'm going to have to do. I want to follow him, but I know I've got to protect Teddy. And as those boys marched down the road and took a turn to the corner, my dad followed Teddy, and Teddy looked to the right, and then he looked to the left. And as he looked to the right, he saw woods full of big trees, oak trees, big stumps, and all kinds of archaic things and large lumber and bigness. And Teddy said to my dad, "Look over there. There's a jungle." My dad said, "That looks like a woods." And Teddy said, "But we don't want that jungle." And Teddy abruptly turned to his left and he looked across the street and he said, "There's the jungle we're going to conquer. Come on, let's go." And Teddy pulled out the machete. He crossed the street and he said, "Come on, brother Tom. We got worlds to conquer, journeys to make, and trails to blaze. People will follow us for days and years. They will tell the story for many years to come. They will be telling them to our children and our children's children and then children's children. Follow me, my brother." And my dad followed the piper just like the brother that he should and should have done, both in awe and for protection. And as they walked across the street, there was no woods there. There was no trees there. There was no condominiums there. There was no farm there. There was no cows. There was no green pasture. There was no bricks. There was no mortar. There was nothing there except acres and acres of corn. Can you imagine the horror of little Tommy when he was following big brother Teddy with a large machete across the street and he took on the corn like he was nobody's business? Back and forth, machete, follow me, brother. We got a trail to blaze. We are going to set the journey, and they're going to be talking for us for days and days to come. I love you. I'll take the lead. And as he macheted through the cornfield for who knows, hours, as long as the story goes, my dad followed Teddy through this cornfield. And as the story grew, it became probably the largest maze in corn ever created because the boys got lost in the cornfield. And as what they thought they were chopping a trail, they were actually trying to chop their way out of lost. They couldn't find their way out. And my dad followed his brother to the end of time. I tell you, my dad loved his brother. Teddy succumbed to the world a different way than maybe Tom. Teddy was my favorite uncle. He was the greatest uncle because he was wired differently. He taught my dad how to chop a machete through a jungle, how to not be afraid of things around the corner, how to take things head on, not to worry about the status quo, although it caused many, many troubles in his life. He wasn't able to follow the path of the Boy Scouts like my father did. He wasn't able to follow the path of athletics and being a 16-letter winner. He wasn't able to follow the path of getting a college degree. He wasn't able to follow my father's path to becoming the greatest coach to ever walk the planet in high school from 1968 to 1976. But he was at all my father's events. He was at every family event. He had his odysseys. He had his quirks. But there was no question that he was the greatest uncle ever. He was just wired a little differently. He died about 8 years ago and of a different sort of death, you know. He was a great uncle. But the idea of the story, the idea of the beauty of the story, the idea of these little boys charging through a cornfield was one of the earliest stories was ever told to me. And I remember wanting to aspire to not be just like my dad, but to be like Teddy. I wanted to take on the world. I wanted to have my own machete. I wanted to blaze my own trail. I wanted to be this person that didn't have to listen to everybody all the time, and I could see, be, and think differently. I didn't want to be my father at that point. I wanted to be Teddy.
I didn't want to be the follower. I didn't want to be that person that was following and just protecting somebody and trying to figure out what's going on in that cuckoo for Cocoa Puff brain. But this is fun, right? I wanted to be the guy leading the charge. I wanted to be the guy that I wanted to be Teddy. The story was about a little boy wanting to be like another little boy. You see, the stories that we tell, the stories that emit from us have to be stories of goodness and understanding, because stories tell a story. And this story tells me, and it tells you, that we follow stories. We immerse ourselves in stories. You lost yourself in my story. You found yourself in my story. You became part of that story, a true story. You asked yourself if you were Teddy or if you were Tommy. You asked yourself, which one do you want to be, in the beginning or the end? You asked yourself, where does this story fit in my life? The greatest story ever told is the gospel. But what I want to share with you about the gospel and the greatest story ever told is that it's a story. Stories are meant to teach. Stories are meant to love. Stories are meant to amuse, encourage. Stories are meant to be vibrant. Stories are meant for you to sink into and sell yourself to the story. Escape for just a little bit. I want to be a great storyteller. I want my tombstone to read, "Here lie a storyteller." You know, it's interesting how I get up in the morning and I put these things together, and I have a good idea. But I never really truly have a full grasp of where it's going to end. I flew in last night about 1 a.m, and I got up at 4:30 to start preparing for the day and this story. And if you could see my list, you could see that I had lost sheep, wine to water, the boy in the race, dad brother stories. I just didn't plan on that being a story. I didn't plan on that being story, but I planned on the story being the story. So I want you to understand the story for you today is, what's your story? What stories can you tell? What stories do you remember? What are you learning from stories? Are you Teddy or are you Tommy? Or are you both? But more importantly, do you know the story of Jesus Christ? Do you know the story of truly being wired different? Right? Being a misfit of this world. Teddy and Tommy were misfits. I'm so grateful for the stories. I'm so grateful for my life. I'm so grateful to be your coach, and I'm so grateful to be America's coach. I'm so grateful, grateful, grateful. So let's get it on like Donkey Kong. Let's let it rip, potato chip. I want you to think about the first story you remember as a child. I want you to think about the first story that ever sunk into you. What did you learn from it? I want you to deep dive. I want to know what that very first story is that you remember. What did you get from it? It's important. And then I want you to understand, where does that fit in Jesus' story? Are you Teddy or are you Tommy? I love them both, and I love you. You guys are amazing. Have a great day. Be a storyteller.